Now on BBC One, this week's Inside Out with Jamie Coulson.
Hello and welcome to Inside Out from Lincoln. This week, the things you should know before buying a family pet. We investigate the Lincolnshire breeders selling sick puppies to unsuspecting dog lovers. We meet people who've bought dogs only to end up regretting it.
I said to my husband, he's dead. And he said, don't be so silly, and he was dead.
Also tonight, 20 years on, memories of Hillsborough from those who were there.
While it's unavoidable and it's not our fault, you kind of feel well, they're here to watch us play. And if we weren't playing, they would not have been killed.
And the woman whose family made the ultimate sacrifice in the First World War.
She didn't regard it as a sacrifice, which was something that had to be given willingly. She hadn't given her sons willingly.
With 3 surprising stories from where you live, I'm Jamie Coulson, and this is Inside Out. Now, as a nation, we spend millions of pounds each year on pedigree dogs, and if they're raised by careful breeders, they can bring years of joy. But Nicola Rees has discovered that some of the animals being sold here in Lincolnshire have severe health and behavioural problems.
Pedigree dogs are big business. The so-called perfect breeds can cost hundreds, even thousands of pounds.
For most responsible breeders, the health and welfare of their dogs is paramount. But as we found out, that's not always the case.
Literally, it was a case of, here's a puppy, it's ready today, give us your money, then you can have it.
Because we put them on at 800, we go like, push.
Okay.
Because people can't get hold of them at the price.
Buy a puppy from this place and your dream dog could quickly turn into a nightmare.
I was completely devastated that I'd totally fallen in love with this brand new little puppy who clearly was about to die.
I said to my husband, he's dead. And he said, don't be so silly, and he was dead.
Buying a pedigree dog should be like buying peace of mind. You can be sure of the dog's history and its bloodline, and that should mean a healthy dog with a good temperament. That's exactly what restaurant owner Justine Gregory thought she was getting when she paid more than £400 for Floyd the Cocker Spaniel.
He was absolutely gorgeous, he was tiny, he was 8 weeks old. I instantly knew that he was going to be my new best friend.
Justine found Floyd on this website. Little Rascals is a family-run business in Brant Bruton near Lincoln.
Hello and welcome to the home of Little Rascals.
I woke up on the 4th morning, he'd been vomiting all night, he'd had terrible blood in his diarrhoea, and he clearly was about to die.
Floyd had pneumonia. Luckily, after weeks of treatment, he did recover, but things were soon to get even worse.
We started noticing that he had some really strange behavioural problems. His eyes went red, he would foam at the mouth, his hackles on the back of his neck went up. So quite clearly, he at the age of 16 weeks, had some really bad aggression.
Sadly, Floyd's case is not unique. We've discovered dozens of official complaints against Little Rascals, and many of them tell a familiar story.
This is Angela Bradley and this is Chloe. Angela recently bought Chloe from a specialist Basset Hound breeder. She's fit, healthy and comes with all the paperwork you'd expect of a purebred dog. But Angela has had to learn the hard way. Last year her best friend Hugo, who was also a Basset Hound, died with horrific health problems. He was another dog sold by Little Rascals.
I found out he got bone disease 6 months old, and it affected all his joints. And his personality changed, he got aggressive. He said he got jaundice, enlarged pancreas, enlarged kidney, liver and everything.
Hugo had a short and painful life. He died at home with Angela when he was just 14 months old.
I mean, there was times he had me in tears because I couldn't really cope with him, although I loved him, you know what I mean? I loved him.
Before you spend any money on a pedigree dog, make sure you found a breeder that specialises in the particular breed you want. Little Rascals here specialises in at least 22 different pedigrees and designer dogs, something a reputable breeder would never do.
But when you're faced with a puppy as cute as this, it's easy to ignore that advice. That is, until things start to go wrong.
I put him in the car and he literally was bright red in the eyes, he was foaming at the mouth, he was banging his head against the window, and at that point I realised that the time had come where I had to consider obviously putting Floyd to sleep.
Almost all our breeding dogs are Kennel Club registered. We are one of the best known breeding kennels in the East Midlands.
Really? Well, let's find out. We're sending in the secret cameras. Mark Goodman's a vet with 15 years experience and Lucy's a BBC researcher. They're rigged with covert recording devices and they're about to have a closer look at Little Rascals.
Flowers are £800 each. Is that too much for?
This is Bridget Dickens and this is her mother, Penny Swindles. Between them, they sell thousands of puppies every year. There are literally hundreds of dogs on site, in cages, barns and outhouses. It's a huge operation.
It was clear to me that that place was a puppy farm. There were so many dogs there. And I guess just to see all the dogs effectively caged, confined, I couldn't imagine that the dogs would have a proper quality of life.
Would you buy a dog from Little Rascals?
No. No, not a chance.
Little Rascals supply pedigree certificates with all their dogs, but they're not worth the paper they're written on, as Justine found out when she bought Floyd.
This is supposed to be an official record of Floyd's ancestry. Trouble is, it's just a load of meaningless names. In fact, we've contacted some of the top breeders of Cocker Spaniels in the country, and not one of them has ever heard of any of these so-called pedigree dogs.
The Kennel Club is the UK's official register of purebred dogs, but there's little chance that any of the pups sold by Little Rascals could make it onto that register with papers like this.
A KC registration is meant to be a sign of quality by a dog that's registered, and according to their own literature, you can expect a healthy dog that's true to its breed and has a good temperament. A bit like you, Callan.
Sadly, though, that's not always the case. I'm leaving Little Rascals behind for now to investigate yet another complaint about a poorly pup. This one, though, was apparently bought from a KC-registered breeder. And here she is. Madeline Butilar's been breeding dogs for more than 30 years. She looks like the perfect breeder, but looks can be deceiving. 19-year-old Donna Gatton bought one of Madeline Butilar's puppies last year.
When we first got him, he was very ill. He had mites. It was a very bad skin condition. It'll be with him for the rest of his life. He has problems breathing. It's not what you expect when you pay £1,000 for a pedigree dog.
We've discovered dozens of people have had problems just like Donna's after buying puppies from Madeline Butilar.
And once again, we've tracked down a whole pile of complaints going back several years.
Mrs Butilar sells her dogs from her luxury home in Greetham near Horncastle. Once again, we've sent our undercover team in for a closer look.
They're just beginning to get, to wriggle about and stuff.
They're only 4 weeks old. Oh, little things.
How did it go?
Well, we've just been to Mrs Butilar's and had a look at 2 pug puppies. And the whole house, it looked clean and, she did seem to be a caring breeder.
So it looks and sounds legitimate, but here's the problem. Mrs Butilar's operating illegally. She's only supposed to be breeding dogs as a hobby, not to sell. She hasn't held a commercial breeder's licence since 2006.
And how much would this little one be?
They're £8.50, the boys.
£8.50.
Yeah.
By law, she can't breed more than 4 litters a year, but we've discovered she's registered at least 8 litters with the Kennel Club in 2008, and that's before you count the extra litters registered by other members of her family.
But you are so lovely. Lovely.
Unlike Mrs Butilar, Little Rascals does have a full commercial licence. The business is run by the Swindles Dickens family, and they've issued a statement to the BBC. In it, they say their premises are RSPCA approved, but that's not true. The RSPCA have told us they do not run any sort of approval scheme for puppy breeders. Little Rascals say they can't comment on the individual cases of Floyd and Hugo, but they do say all their puppies are health checked by a vet prior to being made available for sale. They also say that they've had more than 100 positive comments in their visitors book. Madeline Butilar, on the other hand, refused to issue a statement to answer our concerns, so we tried again to talk to her at home.
Well, it doesn't look like Mrs. Butelaar wants to talk to us. We're not sure if she's in or not. She's clearly ignoring us if she is. We've sent her a letter over a week ago, which she's ignored. We've spoken to her on the phone 3 times. She's refused to be interviewed. And now today it looks like Mrs. Butelaar certainly doesn't want to answer any of our questions. We know the local council is very keen to talk to her. Maybe she'll have more time for them.
It seems finding a good breeder can be a difficult job. The RSPCA says the whole system needs better regulation, but unfortunately that's not going to happen overnight.
And you can find out more information about what you need to know before buying a dog on our webpage at BBC Online. Coming up on Inside Out, the Iraq War veteran learning about the sacrifice made by a previous generation. On a sunny Saturday afternoon in 1989, more than 40,000 supporters gathered in Sheffield to watch a football match. The events of that day would cost 96 people their lives and change the face of sport forever. As the bereaved prepare to mark the 20th anniversary of the Hillsborough disaster next month, I've been to meet some of those who'll never forget that day. You're warned that you may find some of the pictures in this film distressing. The legendary late-great Liverpool manager Bill Shankly is often quoted when people talk about the passion the sport inspires. He once said that some people believe football is a matter of life and death, and famously added, "I can assure you it's much, much more important than that." And on April the 15th, 1989, here at Hillsborough Stadium in Sheffield, his words suddenly seemed prophetic, but at the same time, the game of football became irrelevant. When football fans start dying to watch the game they love, then sport loses its importance.
I'm no longer a mum, I'm no longer a wife, so my whole world turned upside down, basically.
It's a great entertainment, but it shouldn't cost a life.
As a player, one way or the other, it didn't affect me at all, but as a human being, it was very profound.
The pictures are truly horrific, and it upsets me to see them again.
This is BBC cameraman Ian Young, filmed 20 years ago. On the day of the disaster, he'd been sent to Hillsborough as part of a news crew, but soon it became apparent he wouldn't just be there to film post-match interviews with the winning manager.
The year before, I'd filmed the equivalent match between the same 2 teams at the same ground, and it was obvious as soon as I saw these crowds that they were doing it differently to the year before. The police the year before had formed a cordon well short of the turnstiles, and they were searching fans as they approached the cordon, and it was orderly and it worked well. In contrast, 1989, there were fewer police around and everybody was allowed to the turnstiles in massive numbers.
With the crush threatening to topple brick walls, the fateful decision was taken to open a side gate to relieve the pressure outside. But as this CCTV footage shows, it unleashed a human tide which spilled onto the already dangerously full Leppings Lane terraces. Ian Young's pictures from inside the ground show what happened next.
I'd certainly never seen anything like it before or since. The main thing that I had in mind was just to keep filming, because these are extraordinary pictures, and even though one might want to help in some way with what was going on, my main task was to record the pictures for news. Now it's at this point when we start to have abuse hurled at us, myself and my recordist. And it got quite dangerous for us. So at that point we left the steps of the police box and actually went onto the pitch.
Much of the material Ian shot that day was deemed too distressing ever to broadcast on television.
On the day, it didn't mean too much at all because I had a job to do, but those pictures came back to haunt me night after night when you find it difficult to go to sleep. I feel great sorrow when I see these pictures.
The Sheffield Wednesday manager Brian Laws was a Nottingham Forest player at Hillsborough that day.
The game had kicked off and you couldn't speak to any of the players, they couldn't hear you. Yet I remember hit the Beardsley, hit the crossbar, and it got the crowd going. We had the ball around, it was around about here, picking the ball up, and then just about to throw it in, and somebody's run across me. I couldn't get where he was coming from.
With fans spilling onto the pitch, the referee waved the players off to the dressing rooms for what was expected to be a delay.
We were sort of, cocooned in our own little environment and not knowing what was going on the pitch. It was only really until a chief inspector walked in and said, look, there's been a fatality and there's a delay. And Brian Clough immediately just sprung to his feet and said, fatality? Hang on a minute, lad, this is a game of football. And, if there's a fatality, we're going on.
Liverpool fan Jenny Hicks was at the game with her husband Trevor and their 2 daughters.
We'd been allocated 3 standing tickets and 1 seated ticket. I would have been happier, to be quite truthful, to have gone into the standing with the girls, but they insisted that I take the ticket for the seat, so I was actually in the north stand and Trevor and the girls went on to the Leppings Lane terrace.
Jenny's anxiety grew. It became obvious that something was terribly wrong and she was powerless to act.
I started asking people who were around me, could they see any girls, because I was looking for my daughters and Trevor. It was a horrible, horrible situation to find yourself in. It's like watching a horror movie.
The next time she saw her daughters, Jenny was identifying their bodies in a makeshift morgue.
We drove up to Sheffield that morning with 2 beautiful teenage girls in the back, laughing and joking about how we were going to win the game and planning things for the following week. And we drove home that night, just Trevor and I, with an empty car. It was indescribable, really.
Her loss is hard to comprehend, but was repeated for all the bereaved families of the 96 who died that day. The outpouring of grief touched the entire nation. Former England international John Barnes was a Liverpool player that day. In the aftermath of the tragedy, he got to know many of the bereaved families and some of the lucky ones.
2 days later, we went to the hospital in Sheffield. Incredibly, people were coming out of comas when we were there talking to them. Hopefully we would have thought they were going to come out of coma anyway. But when you see Ian Rush and Kenny Dalglish talking to people and they're waking up, that's just an incredible feeling.
How much of an impact did that day have on you as a person?
There was a little bit of guilt, I must admit, with me. I'm sure with a lot of the players, because while it's unavoidable and it's not our fault, you kind of feel well, they're here to watch us play. And if we weren't playing, they would not have been killed. There was I must admit, a little bit of irrational guilt on my part.
For him, like all the players contesting the semi-final that day, running out onto a football pitch could never quite feel the same again.
This is supposed to be the happiest of the Liverpool fans' lives, and I have children, and my son was actually there. He's only young, but then you think of all the young ones who had lost their lives as well, who had been involved in it, and that could have been me, that could have been my son. So as a player, one way or the other, it didn't affect me at all, but as a human being, it was very profound.
As the shock turned to grief, the recriminations began. The fans blamed the police for the crowd control shambles that led to the crush. Lord Justice Taylor, who conducted the inquiry into the tragedy, agreed, citing the failure of effective police control on the day as the main cause.
The prosecutor, Alan Jones QC, said that Mr Duckenfield and his deputy Bernard Murray were in a uniquely favourable position to see what was happening. But he said the 2 police officers regarded Liverpool supporters as a security problem, not as vulnerable men, women and children.
A private prosecution for manslaughter against the 2 senior police officers in charge that day failed to secure any criminal convictions. But one aspect to come out of the tragedy is what could ensure it never happens again. For those not old enough to remember that day, there's a reminder every time they come to a big game in this country. In the aftermath of the Hillsborough disaster, football grounds were made all-seater and the fences that penned in fans were consigned to history. On the 20th anniversary of the tragedy, a month from now, the bereaved will once again gather to remember their lost loved ones, victims of the worst sports stadium disaster in the nation's history. A few weeks ago on Inside Out, we brought you the story of Iraq war veteran Simon Brown, who's rebuilding his life after suffering a horrific battle wound. This week, he's looking at the sacrifice made by a previous generation, in particular one family from Frysthorpe near Lincoln, which saw 5 brothers killed during World War I.
Dear Mother, you will see that this letter puts me on my honour not to say anything about our movements, but I will stretch a point. We shall be into the thick of it, I think, in a day or so, and one stands a good chance of going under. Well, good luck. Your loving son, Harold.
I've come to Lincolnshire in search of a box of letters, all written home from World War I to Amy Beachy. She sent 8 sons to fight the war, and 5 of them died. Lincolnshire's very own Saving Private Ryan. I've been to war myself, Kosovo and Iraq. That's where I was shot. I've seen what my parents have gone through, so I can imagine the pain the Beachy family suffered 5 times over. The story begins here in the quiet Lincolnshire village of Frysthorpe, home to the Reverend Prince William Thomas Beachy, his wife and 14 children.
There wouldn't be a deal of difference you see today the way they would have seen it back at the turn of last century. They lived in this beautiful idyllic part of Lincolnshire and he's buried in the churchyard here. And this is the plaque on the wall here dedicated to the 5 sons who were lost. They call it the Great War. They didn't call it the First World War, they call it the Great War. They didn't think there was going to be anything after it. Nearly every year of the war they lost a Beachy boy. And there's only 2 families in the kingdom lost 5 sons.
Until recently, this plaque was all the world knew about the Beachy's war. They'd enlisted one by one: Barnard or Bar, Frank, Charles and Len. Eric trained with the Medical Corps and spent his war as an army dentist in Malta. But the first 2 to see any fighting were Harold and Chris. They'd emigrated to Australia and so got their first taste of action with the Anzacs at Gallipoli.
The landings on the Gallipoli Peninsula took place on the 25th of April. The Australians landed before dawn. The landings were a tremendous heroic feat, but soon bogged down into stalemate. In fact, 9 months later they had to evacuate the peninsula.
Dear Mother, I've had a rather rough time. 96 hours of heavy duty. It's only my habit of never travelling in a bunch that has saved me, on the idea that if it gets me...
How Chris was hit. He was where he was not supposed to be, as is often the case when a chap stops one.
For the writer who'd been researching another First World War story, coming across these letters was like finding treasure.
Someone sent me a photograph, and she was a niece of Amy Beachy, his mother who'd lost 5 boys, and she said she had some family papers. I went down there one Maybank holiday, 2002 it was, and there on the table was this little brown case, and it was piled high with letters from these 8 brothers in fact, and it was just quite staggering. I was almost quite overwhelmed.
Amy Beachy's letters from the trenches had been kept quietly in a case for 2 generations. They're now with her granddaughter Joey, niece to the Beachy boys.
The war wasn't talked about. Right. The sorrowing grieving had gone by. I knew what had happened, but it was all at the back of the mind.
It's fascinating to hear her read them, especially for a soldier like myself.
I only got about an hour's sleep. I was on duty till 1 a.m. and up again at 4
for stand 2. Which means that we all get our equipment and wait for an hour before...
First light.
Yeah.
That's a regular thing today, that is. We do a stand 2, first light and last light. So you watch the sun go down, you watch the sun come up, and see if the enemy are ready for you.
That letter was written only 10 days before he died.
Sergeant B.R. Beechey. Place not stated. 25th of September 1915, killed in action.
Within 2 years, 4 other brothers followed. Frank was killed on the Somme.
The Battle of the Somme is infamous in British history. The first day of the battle, the 1st of July 1916, is the worst ever day for the British Army. 20,000 men died in one day. What is less well remembered is that the Battle of the Somme went on until November 1916.
I was for some time unable to communicate with my battalion owing to the fog and smoke. I tried all ways and eventually your son volunteered to take out a telephone wire and telephone. He had not gone far in this gallant attempt before he was hit.
Len, Harold and Charles all died in 1917. Len at Cambrai, Charles in East Africa and Harold at Bullecourt. Harold's death notice arrived with a list of his personal possessions.
A pair of hairbrushes, a language book, a wallet cover, letters, writing pads, 2, and a photo.
It's not a lot to say what a life's worth, is it? No,
it is not.
I know.
No.
It's a very hard thing for us today. Is packing up a friend's effects when he's killed in action.
There's a strange feeling that as I sat there listening, it's almost felt like these were people I'd served with, and I was listening to the mother read the letters. It wasn't listening to letters that had been written, nearly 100 years ago. It was listening to letters that somebody could have written while I was sat there chatting to them while I was in service. At the time, Amy Beechey was famous for being the mother of 5 dead soldiers. Michael Walsh has been tracing her story, visiting Lincoln's Guildhall, where in 1918 she was presented to the King and Queen.
King George and Queen Mary thanked Amy Beechey for her sacrifice, and Amy Beechey just curtsied. She was too gracious to tell their Majesties that she didn't regard it as a sacrifice, which was something that had to be given willingly. She hadn't given her sons willingly.
Unlike the story of Saving Private Ryan, after all this, Amy's youngest son was called up and sent to fight.
It must have been terrible for Amy Beechey, but her son's letters of the time really show no qualms about going out there. In fact, he can't wait to see action.
The war ended and Amy's loss was forgotten until Michael Walsh's research sparked an interest. Joe Cook even found and renovated Amy's grave, but still felt something was missing.
I thought, what could I do to bring Amy Beechey with her 5 sons back together again? So we had a brand new piece of stone made, and that was just like putting her 5 sons at the bottom of her bed. That's the way I felt it.
It was a completely different conflict to what we serve in nowadays. Although every time a life is lost, it's hard. They were losing men at such a higher rate than us that the appreciation for those that served before us, I know in the eyes of soldiers nowadays, it's almost unquestionable.
That's all from here in Lincoln. Matthew Wright's back next week with Inside Out stories from across England.